42 years means that we have a testimony. 42 years means that you have hindsight vision on what God has done in your life. 42 years means some clarity has come your way, that you can look back and you can tell a story. That you have a testimony of God's provision. You have a testimony of His sovereignty. You have a testimony of His providence. You have a testimony of His grace and of His mercy and of His love and of His kindness. 42 years simply means that you have a testimony and a story that you can tell. This church has a testimony, but guess what? You also have a testimony. Each person in this room can look back and tell a story of how they've gotten to where they currently are. Today I want to talk to you about one verse that really caught my attention as I was talking and thinking through what I would talk about this morning. And it's what I call a testimony for the ages, because this verse spells out how that thing works. It spells out how a testimony works, how this church has gotten to where it is, how you've gotten to where you are, how I'm even able to stand on this stage right now and be where God has called me to be at this very moment. It's a testimony. It's found in Genesis 50, verse 20. Now, you're going to know it well. After I read this verse and say it out loud, you may make the church face because you know this is your verse. But Genesis 50:20 simply says this: Joseph was looking at his brothers, and he said, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many lives." That right there is a testimony. He's looking back on his life and he's recounting his story to get him to the place where he currently is now at about 100 years old. He died at 110. And he's looking back and letting the people in his presence know, his brothers, that there was something bad that happened. But God was able to turn around and make it good. It was to bring me to the place where I'm currently standing. And the goal is always to preserve somebody's life. That's this church's testimony. Everything wasn't always good at the beginning. There were some hard things that we had to work through in order to get to the present place where we currently stand. But even though we had some hard things, God took those hard things and made them good things, so that we can get to a pinnacle or a present result where He has us. And the goal is always to preserve somebody's life. That's how the testimony works. That's how your testimony works. That's how Joseph's testimony worked. And he's letting us know, he's giving us some of his 20/20 vision and some of his hindsight, so that some of us that may be in the hard part or the pit part or the dark part, the empty part, the part that's hard, give you a little bit of some of his vision so that you don't give up. Because there's going to be somebody in the future that's going to be counting on your testimony. The reason why you're sitting in this room is because early on when things are tough, the church didn't give up. And now there are many people who are benefiting on the church's testimony. The fact that we can stand here for 42 years. But Joseph lets you know that this testimony, it's an investment that God makes in your life. In other words, it starts in the red and moves its way to the black. Most people meet God and they want it to start in the black. No, when God makes an investment in your life because He has a place where He's trying to take you, He's going to make that investment and you'll find yourself starting in the red. But it's for the goal of that investment to take root so that you can move to the black. That's why you can't make the mistake and look at where somebody is currently and think that you know their story. You can't come to this church and sit down and see how big it is and all the land and all of the buildings and think that you know how we got here. A lot of people make assumptions when they look at other people and what they have or where they live and what they drive, and they start assuming things about them. But really the reality is you don't know them. You don't know what God took them through to get them to the place where they currently are. Because there were things that each person in this room has gone through to make it where you are or are going through in order to get to the place where God wants you to be. It's called a testimony, and Joseph spells out how this thing works. He said, you meant it for evil. It started bad, but God meant that thing for good in order to bring about this present result, in order to preserve somebody's life. He starts out by telling his brothers, you meant it for evil. You know what he was talking about. You know the story. I just want to survey it for a second. He's talking about Genesis 37. You see, Joseph was the man who had favor from his father. His father loved him and gave him a robe or a tunic, a varicolored tunic that represented dominion and authority, that represented his calling, that represented the fact that he had been handed rights, firstborn rights, even though he wasn't the firstborn. So he had that external evidence of the father's favor that he was wearing. But not only did he have that, Joseph had a dream. He was a visionary. He had a dream of things that he was thinking about, how high up he would go, and that his brothers would actually be bowing down to him. And so somebody didn't give his brothers the memo that favor ain't fair. Somebody didn't let his brothers know that everybody doesn't get portioned out the same. It doesn't work like that. Matthew 25 wasn't written then, so they didn't know about the talents and the 5 and the 2 and the 1. They didn't understand all of that, so they didn't get the memo that favor isn't fair. So when they saw that tunic and when they heard those dreams, they were jealous, and they did not want Joseph to experience the calling on his life. So it says in Genesis 37, 23 and 24, that his brothers stripped him of his tunic, his varicolored tunic, and then they threw him into the pit. And the pit was empty without any water in it. So here Joseph is going from having the father's favor to being stripped of the external evidence of the father's favor, then being thrown into a pit, and then being in a pit where he's not even getting the simplest of provisions, water, and feeling that it's empty. Here he is in the pit of his testimony. He's thinking and recounting Genesis 37 while he's at Genesis 50, 30 to 100 years old. And he's letting you know that this thing started bad. You know what my brothers tried to do? They tried to strip me of the Father's favor. That there are people, well, you know it's bad when the people that you think you can tell your dream to are jealous of the very dream that you have. And people that you think will push you towards your dreams are the ones who want to strip you from your dreams. It's a sad reality when the people closest to you don't want to see your well-being because they didn't get the memo. That favor is just not fair. And so they stripped him of the external evidence of the Father's favor on his life. But why did they do that? Because they couldn't strip him of his dream. That's internal. So because they couldn't reach into his brain and strip him of his dream, that's what they wanted. They decided to strip him of the evidence of his dream so that his external body would never make it to his dream. See, this is a tactic of the enemy. John 10:10, the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. He's trying to take your testimony from you. And the way that he does that is to strip you of the external evidence of the Father's favor in your life so that you will feel like you have lost the Father's favor in your life. And if I can make you feel like you have lost the Father's favor, then I can make you operate as if you do not have the Father's favor. So what the brothers were doing is they were stripping him externally, but it was so that they can get an internal result, get him into a pit where he can't move. If I can make you depressed, if I can make you think that your life is worthless, if I can make you think that God is not doing anything with you, that that's where you're going to stay, that's who you're going to be, that's the identity that you're going to have, then I can kill you even when keeping you alive because you won't have a testimony. You won't have a Genesis 50 experience because me stripping you externally has stripped you internally. That's what the enemy did with Job. You've read the story. He took his house. He took his family. He put boils on his skin. He did all of these external methods, but it was for an internal result. You need to deny God. My purpose is to try to get you to denounce God. It's not about all of these external things. I'm just using that as a vehicle. He did it with Adam and Eve. You see this fruit, you see that tree. He got him to think about the external, but the purpose was for internal sin, to mess up the world. He did it with Jesus in Matthew chapter 4. He showed him the rock, turn it into bread. He showed them the kingdoms of this earth. I'll give them to you, but I need you to bow down and worship me. He's always trying to do something in our external world to strip us of what God is trying to do in the spiritual providential world. That's what Joseph is talking about when he recounts this story. And that happened to us as a church. Most people don't know that there was a time where we had nowhere to go. As a church, we were at Adele Turner, which is my elementary school, right around the corner here on Polk Street. And we had nowhere to go because the school had decided, even though we were meeting there and God's favor was there and we were clothed with a place to meet in a church house, they decided they could not host us anymore. They decided that we have to move you along. And so my parents and the elders and deacons at that time were in a rock and a hard place because I thought we had the Father's favor, but now we're stripped of the external evidence that we used to have. And so this church has experienced what it is to feel and see the Father working in your life, but then to also see the enemy try to strip it from you. But just because the enemy strips it doesn't mean that God doesn't still have it. Just because you lose, because the enemy does this, just because you lose the external evidence of the Father's favor doesn't mean you don't still have the internal providence of what God is doing. We have to have clarity of vision, and Genesis 50 gives us clarity of vision based on this testimony. That God has a testimony for your life. He has a purpose for your life. It is not random. You are not here just to sit, soak, and sour in a random, mundane way of living. He can't create the universe and create a self-sustaining world based on the water from Antarctica when it melts and goes down so that we can have vegetation, so that we can still breathe and have all of these things that are working in unison like your body, but then create you for a random purpose. It doesn't work like that. God has a purpose for your life. If he didn't, you wouldn't be sitting in here. But what the enemy wants you to do is think otherwise when he puts you in that pit. Oh, I'm not going to make it. I'm not really sure that I'm not going to get there. I don't really know if God has my back. I feel forgotten. This isn't for me. I see what everybody else is doing, but my vision is fuzzy because I don't see what God is doing in my life. That is a tactic of the enemy to ruin your Genesis 50 experience. That God is trying to do something, and Joseph is letting us know how this thing works. My mom can tell you of how she worked in the sweat factory for years at the beginning. We call it that because it was our garage. And in the garage, there's not no air conditioning up in there. It's hot. But she was trying to help Tony Evans get to where he was trying to go. And so she would call my sisters into the sweat factory so that they could put tapes in the envelopes. Tapes, not CDs, not MP3s. Tapes in the envelope to mail all over the country, national and international. They used to do that from their garage. She can tell you the story. So don't think just because this house looks like this now that it didn't start with some pit experiences. This palace is just a result of the pit experiences. This palace is just a result of the testimony of going through Genesis 37 to get to Genesis 50. That's what he did. He threw them into a pit that was empty and it was waterless. And if the truth be told, there are people in the room that are feeling empty. You're feeling like you're not even getting simple provisions. But as the testimony goes, it moves along. It says that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. You notice when God shows up, you have to add a contrast conjunction. See, when God shows up, there is always a but, however, conversely. Something changes when God shows up. Mark 10:18 says, who is good other than God alone? And when he shows up with his nature and you get to experience it. People often ask, well, if God is so good, then why do I experience this much bad? Well, because when you experience the bad, that's what illuminates that he's so good. If everything was always good, you'd be confused on where the good is coming from. And he wants to make sure you're not confused when you get to your Genesis 50 testimony. He wants to make sure you know where this thing is coming from. I don't know if you've ever been to a superhero movie and the movie didn't have no villain or no problem. Oh, that's a dumb movie. Nobody want to watch no superhero movie where he just flying around just because he got power. He needs to be able to fix something in order to throw on a super to his hero. And the reason why we know we serve a superhero, because we standing at 42 years, is because there was some problems that he redirected. It said that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. In other words, we're talking about the same Genesis 37 experience, but God changed the meaning of the same experience. Because we're talking about the same thing, but God is a meaning changer. He comes into the problem and he changes your testimony from a problem to a praise. You're talking about the same thing in your testimony. This is what happened, but let me tell you how God turned that thing around. Because what God does is he steps into those scenarios that you thought you would have never gotten out of, and he pulls you out of them because of who he is. Not because of who you are, but it's because of who he is, so that when you give your testimony in your Genesis 50 experience, he is not excluded. Let me show you how he did that for Joseph. Joseph was stripped in chapter 37. But in chapter 41, you see 41 verses 42, starting there, you see that Pharaoh takes off his signet ring and gives it to Joseph, puts it on his hand. Then Pharaoh clothes Joseph with a royal robe. Then Pharaoh puts a necklace around his neck. Now, the necklace, the royal robe, and the ring mean that you share the authority of Pharaoh. It says that when you come through, everybody's going to bow their knee. Because Joseph had dreams that got him stripped, but he also had dreams that got him equipped. Don't you know that God will allow you to endure a stripping? But it's only because he's trying to position you for a future equipping. Understand that when you are down to nothing, it's only because God is up to something. You realize nobody can really strip you of what God has for you. But God will allow you to be stripped so that he can have you before he gives you what he has. We got to understand that what you're going through is for a testimony. Somebody's life is going to be preserved by your story, so you can't give up, because we're being preserved by this testimony. If my parents were to stop because they were stripped of Elder Adele Turner, we wouldn't be in here right now preserving people's lives. The testimony has to start in the red, but it's only so God can move you to the black and you can say, it wasn't me, he did it. As I recount that story in my dad's story in Adele Turner, because I didn't finish it, we got stripped, and I remember him telling me that he went in to talk to a former linebacker of the Dallas Cowboys named Bob Brunick. Bob Brunick was in there, and I don't know what my dad was doing, but I could probably guess. Don't have anywhere to go. Bob Brunick plays for the Cowboys. Maybe it was to get a check. Because he'll talk about some giving. Now, make sure we got lights. And so he was in there talking to Bob Brunick. They're great friends. So probably just explaining to him that I had God's favor, and now we're stripped of a place to go. And so the church was homeless for a little while. And so he was explaining that to Bob Brunick in his office. But then some random guy walked past the room. And he walked past the room, and then he backed up and stood in the doorway. So no, my dad is talking to Bob, but he's looking back over his shoulder like, who is this cat? Okay, so he's trying to figure out who this dude is. being nosy about our conversation. So he's starting to feel, you know, when somebody's in your stuff, you start to kind of feel some kind of way about why are you standing there? Keep on moving. And then the guy who's standing there gets comfortable on the doorway and crosses his leg. So now he's giving him a hint that I ain't going nowhere. I'm going to stay here and watch and listen to what's going on. Then that dude comes and sits down next to my dad. So now Tony Evans got smoke coming out of his ears and fire coming out of his nose because he's trying to explain to Bob Brunick what's going on with the church. Then the dude start asking questions. And so now my dad is giving him short answers. Yes, no, why are you here? In his mind, he just, yes, you know, okay, well, we're trying to do this. So the guy is probing him for answers and giving him questions. And he tells him, well, you know, there's this little chapel that we have right down the street. We're looking at it. We've been talking to the people about it, but we just don't have the money for it. So we're trying to figure out what we're going to do. And that's when the guy asked the question. He said, well, how much does it cost? And my dad said, in his brain, what's it to you? Why are you here? My dad told him, he said, well, you know, it's $200,000. Then that man pulls out his checkbook and he opens it up. Now the countenance on my father's face just changes. All of a sudden now he's popping his suit and he's answering questions. Well, you know, my overall vision is to have all of the land. And he started doing his sermon kicks. You know, he started stepping around because he's trying to figure out what's about to happen up in here. But that man, he wrote a check for $200,000 and handed it to my father, then got up out of that seat that used to be a nuisance and went back to that hallway and just walked right off. This church has a testimony. God will allow you to be stripped, but it's only so that he can show up and do some equipping up in here, so that you can talk about the goodness of God, so that you can see how you got from point A to your point B. Don't forget, you didn't get here because of your 2 feet. You got here because of his mercy and his grace. You got here because of where he's taking you. That he has a testimony. He's telling his brothers, you meant it for evil, but don't worry, it's okay, because God meant this thing for good. And the last time I checked, when he cast that check, it went through. Because when God comes through, his stuff don't bounce. So I want to use our church, our testimony, to encourage somebody in their testimony. You can't quit in the pit. You can't stop. You can't give up. You got to understand that this good God wants to use that bad scenario to bring you to the pinnacle point that he created you for. And it may not be me. It may not be Tony Evans. It may not be Carolyn. It may not be, but it's yours. And what's yours is yours. He's telling him, you meant it for evil, but God meant this thing for good. So God re-equipped him even though he was stripped. You got that? But I want to show you how else God took that same scenario to turn it and make it good. It says that the pit, Genesis 37, it says, verse 24, it says that the pit was empty without any water in it. Now, I was thinking to myself, now why in the world, sometimes you have to read the Bible and then step back and think a little bit. Why in the world would the author go into so much trouble to tell you the nature of the pit? It's good enough that he got stripped and he in there. Why are you telling me that it's empty and it has no water in it? So I prayed about that for about 3 days. What is the correlation between Joseph having to experience not just a stripping, not just a pit, but also a pit that's also empty and doesn't have the provision of water in it? Then the Spirit threw it up into my mind and said, this is how it works. God will always prepare you for how he's about to use you. If you see in chapter 41, he's giving Pharaoh answers to his dreams that there is a famine coming. Pharaoh puts him in charge over a famine. A famine means you have people who are experiencing emptiness, no food, and who are experiencing no water. So what God will allow you to do is experience the purpose of what he's going to do when he puts you in the palace. Because he doesn't just want you to have the information. When you preserve somebody's life, you need to be able to sympathize with their weaknesses. So he has Joseph in a pit that's empty and waterless because I need you to be able to sympathize with some people who are about to be empty and waterless. When I reclothe you, I need you to know what to do. You can't, if somebody's experiencing sexual abuse, well, that's nice that you can talk to me from a book, but I want to know that you feel my pain. If somebody's experiencing a falling out of the family or a divorce, well, it's nice that you may be even the pastor, but let me talk to somebody that's experienced what I'm going through. There's a way that God wants to use you, and you can always get the identifier by how he's going to use you by keeping your eyes open in the pit. God will always give you evidence in your struggle. See, most people are thinking about the struggle, but they don't have their eyes open to the evidence. If you have your eyes open to the evidence, then even though you're in the pit, you know what God is going to do later. You know that he's going to use it. That's why people are passionate about things they previously experienced. Have you ever noticed that your passion to help somebody comes from the very thing you used to struggle with? God uses that and turns it upside down so that you can have a testimony to preserve somebody's life. Realize this is not just about you. Okay, we like to correlate scriptures, from the New Testament. I can correlate scriptures. You got Romans 8:28. God will work all things out for good for those who love God and are called according to his. See, we jump over pews and we swinging from the rafters on the first part. But he works it out for good because of his purposes. He's thinking about whose life he needs you to preserve. He's thinking about the outworking of his kingdom. A lot of people sit in the pit for an extended amount of time because they want God to change things for their own Christian narcissism. They want God to bring a cloud down to sit on them, for their throne, for their omniscience, for their omnipresence, for what they want to do in their life. You ain't the king, boo-boo. Jesus is trying to do this for his kingdom, for his glory. That's why you're going through what you're going through. So you can't quit. You can't give up. We're sitting in these pews not because we haven't been stripped, but because we kept walking and God equipped. He put us in this place. Joseph got to a point, 41:51. He named his son, Genesis 41:51, he named the fruit Manasseh. He named him Manasseh because it means the Lord has made me forget about all my troubles. Hold on. You forgot? So you don't remember what you went through? No, he remembers because in Genesis 50 he said, you meant it for evil. So it's not that he forgot. It's not that his cognitive capacity has failed. It's just that where he is so plush. Where God has taken him from is so good that where he's been no longer controls him where he is. So even the fruit that comes from me has to get named based on where I am. I didn't name him Pain. I named him Manasseh, which means I don't even remember that stuff. My mom could tell you, I told you about the sweat factory, but when I asked her about the sweat factory, she would always call my sisters in there to help, and, they'd be like, oh, here we go, it's hot. You get frustrated when it's hot, So they're in there trying to help my mom out in the sweat factory, and when I asked her about those days, I said, man, I know that was rough because I wasn't there. I got the best position in the house, baby of the family. All of that rough stuff is over. It's just party, sleep, have fun, bring me something to drink. I'm having fun. But they had it hard. But when I asked her about it, she said, yeah, that was tough. But now we got a ministry that just pumps that stuff out. But now we're on 1,000 stations in over 130 countries. But now I'm not in the sweat factory anymore. I'm in this air-conditioned building that we purchased that pumps out the ministry of Tony Evans. But now I've been the executive director for a national and international ministry for 30 years. But now, because when God shows up, he makes you forget a little bit. You got a little bit of amnesia when it comes to what's going on in your life. Not because you forgot, but because he's just that good. My wife, our first child, for all of you pregnant ladies in the room right now, this won't be your story. But our first child, sweet Kelsey, here she is down there not looking at me. Now I know why God used me, why my dad used me in illustrations all the time, easy pickings. But it wasn't her fault. We got induced with Kelsey probably a week before she was scheduled to be born because they said she was going to be a big baby. And sure enough, she came out at 8'8". So if we would have waited a week, she might have hit that 9. Okay? Our two sons were 9'5" and 9'1". So we ain't playing no games. But we went in, and they laid down, and they gave her medication. We know now that she doesn't need medication to have babies because her labors are quick. Our last child, from the start of her labor to the delivery, was an hour and a half. I mean, shoom. It's like a bullet. But this one, we didn't know it was our first time, and so we had some medication. We got induced. That medication had a negative effect on my wife. She had contractions with no breaks. So she would have, exactly, all the ladies that had babies like, that's whack. So her contractions are going up because I'm looking at it on the monitor, and then it's falling down, and I see her breathing, and that thing goes right back up, and she would say, oh, Lord, here it comes again. And I'm like, Lord Jesus, this is... And I'm thinking, I'm saying out loud, I wish I could take it from you. I wish I could. In my mind, I'm like, man, forget about that. That ain't... I can say that now. I kept it in then. That's not right. Ain't no heroes around here. We're going. Then we went through 16 hours of labor. Okay, this is not going to be your experience, though. And then finally, the baby came, and it was just, yay, we were tired. It was... So I had already shut down in my mind that because of this experience we just had, we done. We won and out of there. I'm pretty sure that my wife is not going to want to do this again. After going through that type of experience, we can't. So after about 10 months passed, she came to me and she said, I'm ready for number 2. I said, I said, but don't you remember what happened with number 1? Don't you remember? She said, I remember, but look at this baby. So what she was looking at overrode what she remembered about the pain of the birth. So I said, are you sure you want to do this? And she said, I'm sure I want to do this. Now I start getting excited. Because while she was telling me she wants another child, I kind of know what that means for me. So while she was talking, I was just like this. I'm ready whenever you're ready. I was just doing the stanky leg. I'm like, just give me a word, Cornelius. Just give me a word. I didn't know we were going to do it, but if you're going to do it, just say something. Was that funny, y'all? It was the baby. See, when God delivers what he's going to deliver in your life, you'll look at that baby and say, oh, it was worth it. Let's do this thing again. There is a testimony. And he said, it was so good that I can't even remember my troubles in my father's household. That God is trying to do something in your life. He's trying to birth something and produce something and bring fruit about, but you can't quit. You can't throw in the towel in the middle of your testimony, or the stripping from the enemy would have won. that he's taken you down, and you never lost the Father's favor just because you lost a little bit of physical evidence. Physical evidence doesn't override God's spiritual providence. So never get it twisted as you're walking through this life that I got to keep going, because somebody's life is going to be preserved based on my testimony. Let me tell you a story about my testimony just for a second. Most people know I was a sports guy. That thing is over now. But I was a sports guy, football player, played at Duncanville High School, won the state championship, then went to Baylor, got educated. We didn't win no games, but my parents thought I was a winner because I got a full scholarship. That means you won. I care less how many games you win. So I've got a full scholarship, full ride to go to Baylor University, and I had a dream. Everybody knows my dream was to play in the NFL. I wanted to play in the NFL, and I told God, just allow me to run out the tunnel. I just want to run out the tunnel. I just want to feel the fire and see the planes and hear the crowd. I just wanted that opportunity to play a few games in the NFL. And I got a chance. I was picked up in the 2005 draft class by the Dallas Cowboys. Some of you Cowboy fans know that's the draft class of Marion Barber and DeMarcus Ware and Jay Ratliff and all of those guys. You don't know me because they were better, but I was there. They still write checks to everybody. I was in there. So I was there, but 3 weeks into being equipped, I was stripped. I walked up to the door, and the guy that we call the Grim Reaper, he stepped out and put his hands on my chest. Then he reached out and he took the playbook. He didn't say a word. He just pointed that way. Because you know what that means. He just going back. Now, I only had 20 minutes to mope because I'm playing for the Cowboys. I'll be home in 20 minutes. So it's not like I got a flight to cry about it. No, I've got to go home and try to reassemble. And then I got a call from the San Diego Chargers. I said, okay, God, let's make this thing happen. Let's make this dream come to life. And then they said, but we're going to allocate you to NFL Europe so that you can develop. I was like, develop? I don't need to develop. So I go to this NFL Europe League, and things keep going downhill. We're in training camp, and you have a 2-hour practice. Then they let you take off your helmet and eat a banana and an apple, put it back on, and go do another 2-hour practice. I said, this ain't for me. I don't want to do this. We're out there in Tampa. It's hot. We finally fly to Germany. It's white walls, white sheets, no English-speaking channels for several months. I wanted to quit. I called my dad, and I told him, I said, I'm going to quit football. I'm out. I'm done. This is not for me. So I said, book a flight because I don't have no money. Me and my brother always talking about we ain't got no money, and we need him to co-sign. I don't need him to co-sign. I need him to sign by himself. I need you to book this ticket so I can get home because this is not for me. I can't handle this stripping that I'm going through. My favor, it seems like it's been lost or gone. I need to go home. So he said, are you sure, son? I said, I'm really sure. Book the ticket. He booked the ticket. I go sit in the coach's office and tell him I'm going home. He said, well, we really don't want you to go home because you're a good player. I said, literally, I don't care what you want. It's Jonathan Evans talk. I care less what you want because I was frustrated, and I'm 22 years old, 23 years old. I'm going home right now. And he said, well, you can't go home right now because you haven't done your exit physicals. You can do your exit physical tomorrow night because that's a liability. You let a player go home before he does his exit physicals, they can come back and say I was hurt on the job and try to get paid that way. So I called my dad and said, I can't go home till tomorrow night. My dad said, don't you think it's interesting? I said, oh, Lord, here goes this philosopher. That you couldn't leave when you wanted to leave? He said, so I want you to do something for me. I want you to go out to one more practice, and I want you to ask God if he wants you there, in spite of whether you think you want to be there. So I went back out to that practice, and I kid you not, in the practice, I was crying. You know when you're really crying because you can't control your neck? I'm crying. My neck is cocking back. I can't do nothing about it. because I don't want to be there. This is a pit for me. It's a pit experience, but I ask God, if you want me to be here, then you're going to have to give me a peace that surpasses all understanding. And I kid you not, the next time I put my hand in the dirt, that's exactly what I felt. Made the next play and turned around and looked at my coach and I said, I'm staying. And he said, okay, great. I don't know where this came from, but then I realized by the end of the season, my teammates had given me a new nickname. They called me Rev. 7 players accepted Jesus Christ. So now I know the business transaction that has to take place to get on the field in the NFL. Oh, so all I got to do is pray for people and lead people to Jesus. Now you're going to let me run out the tunnel, right? So I'm young, so I'm trying to manipulate God for him to put me in the palace where I see myself. So I go to the Titans. I do it, what God has called me to do, but I still get cut. I go to the Washington Redskins. I do it, but I still get cut. But finally in 2011, I'm standing in the tunnel. I circle back around to the Dallas Cowboys. And I call my dad, and I said, Dad, we did it. We here. I'm about to run out the tunnel for the first time. And my dad said, amen, son. Amen. Now, what you should be wondering is, why in the world you got your cell phone in the tunnel? Because the first time I ran out of the tunnel for my first NFL game, I wasn't the player, I was the chaplain. Because God has a plan for your testimony. Now, it may not be your plan, but it's a good plan. And it's to give you a future and to give you a hope. You have a testimony in the room. What I came here to say this morning is the church has a testimony, but it's to preserve somebody's life. You have a testimony, but it's to preserve somebody's life. Don't think it's about you lest you end up like a fruit that's eating itself, rotten. You've been placed here to preserve somebody's life by the blood of the Lamb and the word of your testimony. Jesus Christ has a testimony. The reason why we have a testimony is because he has a testimony. He was rejected by the people who he came to save, but he lived a perfect life. He experienced death, and then he rose to be with the Father. And the only reason why you can be grateful in your testimony is because of his testimony. The only reason why we can celebrate a Jackie Robinson anniversary of 42 years is like, you remember Jackie Robinson, he would go into the stadiums where he was rejected, but he would still hit home runs. Jesus stepped up to the plate over 2,000 years ago. The enemy tried to throw him a curveball, but he had a perfect swing with his life, and he knocked that thing over the center field wall. He ran around first base of his humanity, second base of death and rejection, third base of resurrection, but then he came home to be seated at by the right hand of the Father, and we can celebrate our testimony because of the home run that he hit. We can get excited about our testimony because he gave us a good at-bat. We can be excited about who we are because of who he is. And I'm excited about our testimony as a church because Jesus knocked that thing over the center field wall and the crowd goes wild because Jesus made that thing happen. Because he has a testimony, we have a testimony, and you have a testimony. Tell your story, live your story, because it will preserve somebody's life. Somebody ought to praise him, because that's why we have a testimony in the room.